Do you have more questions than answers? We don't have all the solutions, but we do have a community of people just like you. We are the curious, the seekers, the concerned, those into data, and those that are dreamers. And the closer we get, the better we learn. About ourselves, each other, and about our planet. Now is the time to get closer. Join us. Get your free ticket to the Learning Planet Festival. festival.learning-planet.org.
Hello, and welcome to this Learning Planet Festival session, Learning Ecosystems, a Revolution in the Making. I am Sébastien Turbo. I am the co-founder and CEO of Eco6, a Canadian-based consultancy helping urban communities design living and learning ecosystems. I am also a WISE Fellow. WISE is the World Innovation Summit for Education. And as such, I am currently running a global living lab on learning ecosystems. But more importantly, it is my honor to be the moderator today of what I hope will be an amazing session. Indeed, it is my pleasure to be joined for our session and discussion by four great representatives of the diverse and global learning ecosystems community. Kelly Young, you are the president of Education Reimagined. Vishal Talreja, you are the co-founder of A Dream a Dream. Emma Murphy, you are the communications and outreach coordinator at the UNESCO Dublin Learning City Initiative, And finally, Greg Baer, you are the executive director at the Grable Foundation and co-chair of Remake Learning. Thanks to the four of you for being with us here today. Now, when we were designing this session on learning ecosystems with the Learning Planet team, we realized that, we all acknowledged that there was this growing excitement and enthusiasm around learning ecosystems and their potential. Indeed, we're seeing the world over more and more projects labeling themselves or being labeled as learning ecosystems, a growing number of academic and thought leadership research and papers on this topic, a growing interest from policymakers the world over, and more communities of interest on the question of learning ecosystems, such as the Weaving Lab, the NetEDU community, the Wise Living Lab, and I could go on. But amongst all this kind of excitement and buzz of activities and projects, we wanted to take the opportunity of this session today to take a step back and together discuss kind of two key questions. One, generally speaking, where do we feel we stand today regarding learning ecosystems? Basically, how far have we come and where do we stand today? Second, we'd like to discuss how far we think we could go looking forward. What is the potential of learning ecosystems in truly transforming education, in radically changing the where, the when, the what, the how, and the whom, and the with whom we learn? And linked to this, also discuss what it would take for us to get there and what the main barriers are. I'd also like to take the time to hear from you, our audience, and to take your questions and comments towards the end of the session. So please don't hesitate to share your thoughts and questions in the chat box, and me and the team here will make sure to raise your questions and comments to our speakers. But to get us started, and because for many, this concept of learning ecosystems can sometimes still seem kind of quite fuzzy or intangible or hard to grasp, I'd like to invite our speakers to introduce themselves and their organizations, and more importantly, to share with us what their vision of learning ecosystems has been, or the vision that has been driving them until now, and what they see as the potential of such an approach. And to do so, maybe I'll start and turn to you, Kelly. Would you mind sharing more about yourself, Education Reimagined, and your vision of learning ecosystems?
Sure. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to be here with such amazing people creating ecosystems in reality and on the ground for real kids and families and communities. So Education Reimagined, we are a US-based and US-focused organization that's committed to transforming education. And our focus is really, how do you create a learning system that honors the uniqueness of each child, sees them as capable and curious, and sees learning as not this something that has to be done to kids. Kids are naturally curious, and how do you cultivate that and nurture that and allow them to drive their own learning? And that the purpose of education, rather than our current design of education, which is really designed to transfer standardized sets of knowledge, and then we ask people, we do tests with them, and then we rank them on a standardized assessment. And that really is the current purpose of our education, is to rank and sort young people into which opportunities they will have post-graduation, college, career, and what kinds of careers they have options to, and to transfer a set core of knowledge, which today is an absurd purpose, really, given the economy, given society, and the massive amounts of challenges and innovation possible. We see, and we have been focused on, how do you transform an education system into one that truly honors who kids are, and has them discover, they get to discover who they are, what their gifts are, and how to contribute those meaningfully to the world. And so we are newer to the conversation of ecosystem. And it came out of COVID. We've always known that if you want to transform education, you have to design wholly new systems of assessment, accountability, how funding flows, what the supports for young people are, how it's organized, who is considered part of the education system. We've always known that the community and the world are the playground for learning, and that there's nothing magic about a school building. Yet when we talk about transforming education, people immediately think schools. And we have shifted all of our focus to how do you create learner-centered ecosystems of learning. And we have discovered that when we talk about ecosystems, everybody can see themselves in an ecosystem of learning. And that this vision is not about how do we connect the out of school time and then connect the out of school time to the in-school time. It is rather, if you think of the caterpillar, like we could add wings to the caterpillar, or, right, what really happens is the caterpillar is in the chrysalis, and actually everything is like, I don't even know how it happens, but it's melted almost, and something new is reborn. And we believe that you have to get to the butterfly, not just matching these two systems together, but you have to imagine an entirely new way of organizing, supporting, and credentialing learning that values the curiosity of kids, values the experiences of real, relevant, contextualized learning, whether they're 5 years old learning about grass outside, or whether they are a teenager doing a job or an internship or a service project, that is all great learning. So our vision is one where there is no special place for learning, and there's no distinction between formal and informal, and that we haven't just mushed them together. We've actually put all of our resources together and then reimagined what the system can look like in a beautiful, elegant solution that supports kids.
Thank you, Kelly. It's the first time I hear this image of the caterpillar, the chrysalis, and the butterfly. I love it. I'm going to steal it from you.
Please do.
Michelle, can I turn to you and hear more about who you are, Dream a Dream, and your kind of vision and approach to learning ecosystems?
Thank you, Sebastian. It's a pleasure to be here, and I have to start off by absolutely agreeing with everything Kelly has shared so beautifully. I'm based out of India, co-founder of an organization called Dream a Dream that's been in existence for 21 years. Our focus has been ecosystemic right from the time we started, primarily for two reasons. One, we work with the most marginalized young people coming from communities of high poverty, lack of opportunities, lack of resources, lack of emotional connect, experiences of abuse, violence. So in the very early years, we were working outside the education system on how do we help young people growing up in adversity build the skills and capacities that they need to thrive. One, in a 21st century environment, which is complex, fast changing. And second, to also help them build capacities which will help them overcome their trauma, overcome their adversity. So right from the beginning, our approach has been how do we bring in more community approaches? So how do we bring in, say, artists and coaches and sporting academies and teachers and educators and parents into the system? Because we realized the level of complexity of adversity that kids are coming in from a linear school system that just focused on academics and knowledge delivery is not enough to help them build the capacities that they need to thrive in a fast changing world. Moving on from there, very quickly, we realized that in addition to working with young people and empowering them with the life skills and social emotional competencies, we had to start building capacities of the larger ecosystem also. The larger ecosystem, one that works directly with young people, such as parents and teachers, but also an ecosystem which influences the education policy, the education decisions, but doesn't necessarily have on the ground understanding of the experience of the child. So first step was to start working with teachers on helping them transform from a teacher who's delivering knowledge in academic subjects to now being a facilitator of experiences and learning for a child and helping them build the life skills that they need to thrive. And in the last 5 odd years, we have kind of expanded that ecosystem to also include public education systems. So moving away from communities now into public education systems, where working with various departments of education, the ones that frame policy, the ones that make curriculum, the ones that design teacher training, the ones that do assessments, the ones that are focused on delivery at the school level, who are all siloed and not really thinking of themselves as an ecosystem. How do we start bringing them together, build trust in this ecosystem so that they're all committed to the child, and helping every child and their unique abilities to thrive? So our vision of learning ecosystem is one that's emergent. The initiator can be anyone. It can be from inside a public education system. It could be a nonprofit like ours. It could be a parent. It could be a group of teachers. But once we enter the ecosystem, how are we then bringing all the voices in, and including young people's voices, and how together we are shaping or reimagining a purpose of education from a 30-year vision of what society we want to live in, and then reconnecting that back to what education needs to be today so that we can have a society that we can imagine 30 years down the line. Thank you.
To be Vishal, and actually we'll come back in a few minutes to this idea of 15, 20, 30 years from now, where would we want to be. But first, Emmer, tell us more about the Dublin Learning City initiative and how it links to this learning ecosystems conversation, and the vision that has driven Dublin in spearheading this initiative.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to begin by saying thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here amongst such wonderful speakers. It's a pleasure. So our vision for Dublin Learning City is to enable all citizens of Dublin to learn, regardless of age or cultural background, in both traditional and non-traditional settings. And we do this by supporting and advocating learning infrastructures in Dublin that work to improve access to education. So learning ecosystems have always existed in Dublin, whether they were called learning ecosystems or not. But at Dublin Learning City, what we've done is we've created a common platform that allows these ecosystems to come together, to acknowledge each other, to work together, and to share ideas. And we've seen massive power in that connection. And so that's a basic overview of what we do. Thank you.
Okay. Could you maybe just tell us a bit more about what it looks like in reality today, in terms of who's involved, who's kind of driving it?
Absolutely. So we adapted the title of UNESCO Dublin Learning City in 2019. The model that we have in Dublin is a partnership between formal education institutes and informal. So we partner with 7 universities across Dublin. We partner with Dublin City Council and 2 education and training boards. the education training boards in Dublin are responsible for further education, community education. So it's a lovely mix. So that is our established partnerships. We also have a number of extensive partnerships, which we call on for different projects we run throughout the year. So we also run a learning festival. And throughout the learning festival and various projects, we worked with community groups, individuals, any learning ecosystems that exist in the home, in school, in communities. And we all come together and we share knowledge to anyone who wants to learn and receive it. So all of our projects are learner-centered. What's unique about our learning city is no matter what level of education you come from, no matter what ecosystem you come from, everyone leaves their badge at the door and comes in with an impartial perspective. And our key drive is to create projects that put the learner at the center. It's a fun project. It's a project that allows for a lot of creativity also. So our key projects that we run would be our festival. We do a podcast. We encourage learning communities as well. We map out trails of learning centres that are in different communities. So a number of projects. We are also part of the Irish network of learning cities. So there are 5 cities across the island of Ireland, and we've formed a network and we work together to deliver projects in Ireland. And what's unique about our network is that it is inclusive of learning cities in both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So that is breaking down a lot of cultural barriers that would exist.
Thank you, Emma. You mentioned a learning festival, which is a great transition for me to bring on Greg from the Grable Foundation and the Remake Learning. Greg, could you walk us through what the Grable Foundation does, also looking at Remake Learning, and kind of your vision of learning ecosystems that's driving you and your work?
Thank you, Seb. It is humbling to be here with my colleagues. I already have 100 questions for them. And good morning, everyone. I'm joining you from a place on planet Earth called Pittsburgh, where the sun is just beginning to rise. As Seb noted, I wear a couple hats. One is executive director of a private charitable foundation called the Grable Foundation, focused on the well-being of children and youth here in the Pittsburgh region, especially those who, for economic reasons, haven't had the same opportunities as their peers. And 15 years ago, I founded what is now a learning network called Remake Learning. We would call it a learning ecosystem today, but Seb will acknowledge that 15 years ago, we didn't set out to create a learning ecosystem. Rather, it began with a noticing particularly through the learning sciences, that young people were developing their identities differently, seeking and consuming information differently, and an appreciation that, yes, learning could happen anywhere, any place, anytime. And so as we looked across the landscape of our region, of particular communities, and said, learning happens, yes, in schools, as Kelly noted, and learning also happens in after-school programs, in clubs, in parks, in museums, online at home. When we think about this landscape and all of the places where young people are learning, is there a way to connect these things better in support of the learners and their passions and interests that drive their own agency? Fast forward 15 years to 2022, Remake Learning today is a network of more than 600 schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, creative industries, campuses of higher education, all of whom we say are advancing relevant, engaging, equitable learning in support of our young people, whom we know are navigating these times of unprecedented and rapid technological and social change. So what does that look like? That looks like educators from across our region, early childhood through higher education, in and out of school, coming together to develop a profile of what we want any learner to be, younger or older, all across Southwestern Pennsylvania, and the types of knowledge, skills, dispositions that we want for them to acquire and advance in the course of their upbringing, again, in all of those places where young people are learning. And schools are an important part of that. And so too are all of the other types of learning places that Vishal and Kelly and Emma described.
Thank you, Greg. Now I'd like us to take a few minutes to kind of take a step back from your actual day-to-day projects and vision and ask you more kind of your perspective on this wider learning ecosystems conversation. The question to the panel is a revolution in the making. I guess my question to you is, has this revolution already happened, or is it currently, as we speak, happening? I mean, are we at the beginning of a big wave, a big movement around learning ecosystems? I've had recent conversations with people, big fans of learning ecosystems, telling me that they're worried that this may be yet one other education-related buzzword, and that 2 or 3 years from now we won't be hearing about it. Others have told me that they feel it's plateaued and probably won't go any further than that. So, what's your kind of more macro perspective on where we are around this conversation? If someone wants to jump in, otherwise I'll turn to, okay, great, go ahead.
So I think we're in an exciting moment. And look, I've seen the tangible results all around me in small towns and in the urban center, where schools are approaching learning differently, where out of school time organizations and other sites of learning are approaching learning differently, where they're working differently with one another in ways that Vishal described. When we think about professional learning and professional development, we think about collective work in a region, for example, around advancing computational thinking or maker-centered learning. We see examples of public budgets being distributed differently, and the state of Pennsylvania, through its Department of Education, investing in clusters of learning organizations, schools, and Seb, I also share the concern that this could be incredibly faddish. There's a real danger to this work being a fad. And it's why 6 years ago, we launched a learning festival, similar to the way that Emma just described, because we realized that unless we seriously engage parents, families, and caregivers in this work and help them to understand how learning is being remade, to support the kids in their care with their passions and interests that are different from them as in their own experience, and then really build demand among parents, families, and caregivers for these new approaches to learning in our schools and other sites of learning. Unless that happens and becomes sticky, yes, it could be a sadly passing moment in yet another education reform endeavor.
Okay, so I'll say you're saying cautious optimism, if I may say so, right? Okay, Emma, I think, yeah, you just raised your hands, please.
I agree with everything Greg said completely. And I mean, there is a fear that this may be a fad word or a buzzword. I don't necessarily think that's a negative thing. I mean, I think we can all agree that learning ecosystems have always existed. They've existed at different levels with different participants in different settings. But the fact now that we have a buzzword or learning ecosystems, learning cities, it's given people a common narrative. It's given, an overarching space for lots of different ecosystems to connect. And that's what we see. And Greg mentioned there about in the past 2 years, learning has changed, and learning settings have had to change the way they deliver learning, and learners had to adapt as well. And as we've seen, everyone has been hugely resilient, which is a really positive thing. And I've certainly seen a shift in Dublin Learning City on how people view the project. So previously, I think people looked at learning cities or learning ecosystems as something, that has to fit into a framework, a concept, a model. Since the pandemic, I've seen people shift that lens to how can an ecosystem support an individual? And with that change, there's been a lot of an influx of creativity as well from our partners. And people are starting to acknowledge and accept that a learning ecosystem isn't this conclusive thing. It isn't a defined model, but it's something that's changing and evolving with advances in technology, with a pandemic, with different content, and that's emerging as well. So I think once that change, that an ecosystem is not a stagnant thing, once that was acknowledged, it's opened the door for evolution. Or revolution as well. So I've definitely seen a shift in perspective from Dublin Learning City. And as a result, we've had our most successful year that we had last year. And that was solely down to our partnerships between formal and informal education, working together to put the learner at the center in light of a global pandemic. So certainly that's my perspective on it. So I see it as something that is exciting, it's emerging. We have to accept that it's going to be constantly changing, but I don't see it as something that's going to die out anytime soon.
Okay, good. So yeah, somewhat of a buzz, but which you see as a positive in terms of building this common narrative, even if the concept of itself is very fluid. That's okay with you. Okay, Kelly, I think I saw you not raise your hand, but do you want to?
Yeah.
What's your take on this?
So I think my take, there's like different size time horizons that you could look at, but one very big time horizon is that, you know, for humans, learning is a relational endeavor. And it was the Industrial Revolution that had us redefine how learning happens, where it happens, to what end it happens, and really took the relational part out of it. It became a compliance-based system. So I think humans, because we naturally are drawn to, and we actually do know how great learning happens. It's contextualized, it's relevant, it's with people that care about us, know us. We've always had workarounds for it. Now, they have not been equitable workarounds. But if you think about families, what they do for their kids, and what and I'm sure you all, if you have children, do for your children, you can find out what their interests are, you connect them to it, you help them find mentors and experiences that deepen their skills and their sense of confidence and efficacy. And if you look at Indigenous, if you look at anything that happened and might still be happening pre-industrial, it exists. The question are the institutions, right? We have some fairly, at least in the US, and monolithic institutions that have declared what education is, that are incredibly contrary to that and get in the way of these ecosystems being flexible, adaptable, different for each child, because we have set curriculum, we have all kinds of things, right? And what I see is that ecosystem, the question is, are we going to have a concerted effort to build the kinds of supports for kids to navigate an ecosystem, or are we going to keep allowing people to do the one-offs? So certainly, again, in the US, we have had 3% decline in public school enrollment, which doesn't sound like much, but it's the largest we've ever had. And a lot of that is people searching out these other alternatives, but that is not, again, an equitable approach to this. This is for families who have the capacity to support their kids in navigating. And I'm all for them doing that. But what we could imagine is that the institutions get reformulated right into the butterfly, and that it's not dependent on your family to be able to help you navigate. There are people in the public system that are designed to get to know your child and help them set learning goals and create learning pathways that take you throughout your community. So what to me is inevitable, people are already doing it. You have online learning, you have kids on YouTube, you have all kinds of things of ways people are connecting to their interests, whether our institutions support us in doing that. But the opportunity that we have that is not inevitable is that we take a stand for our institutions to actually embrace this and create the structures, funding, and support for kids.
Yes, and we'll get to that in the next part of our discussion. But Vishal, where do you feel we stand on this conversation? I mean, from your work, your experience, what's your take on how far we've come and where we are today?
So from our context, also from a more Indian context, I think the whole narrative around learning ecosystem is still in its infancy. It's just about emerging. I think right now it is the outliers in the system, mostly social entrepreneurs, who are now, and they're coming from this question that, okay, I recognize we cannot solve the problem alone. The problem is big and complex. And if you take India with 250 million children coming into the education system, organizations or governments alone cannot solve this complexity, which is why then we need to start working together. Right? So we have over the last 2-3 decades evolved from ideas of partnerships to collaboratives, and now to look at ecosystems. And what distinguishes for us a collaborative from an ecosystem is, while a collaborative also has an intentional approach towards a certain outcome, an ecosystem actually becomes emergent. And what one can clarify in an ecosystem approach are the beliefs and values, but not necessarily the outcomes. The outcomes will become emergent because some action that I take towards learning for a child in a particular context might have multiple implications due to the actions of other players too, be it parents or employers. An example is, if we, for example, transform education. So in Delhi, for example, we have brought in a well-being focused curriculum in public education systems called the happiness curriculum to focus on well-being of every child in public education. But if employers continue to just look at grades and academic excellence as a way for employment, this will not work. So we have to then shift the employment ecosystem to see how that contributes to it. So I think right now it's really in the infancy. I think we are juggling between ideas of partnership, collaboratives, and learning ecosystems. We probably need to learn to clarify what learning ecosystems are, what are the beliefs and principles that they stand on. So equity, inclusion, dignity could be some of the principles that ecosystems stand on. One last point I want to add to that is, ecosystems come from a biological metaphor, right? They come from, let's take a forest, for example. So what is visible in the forest, the trees, the shrubs, the plants, the undergrowth, the various insects and animals that the ecosystem then supports and, support each other. But there's an aspect of the ecosystem that's also happening underneath the ground, which is not visible, which is where prejudices, biases, beliefs, social cultural norms sit. So if the society has a norm saying school is the primary provider of learning and knowledge, and we don't have a role to play, that's a certain social cultural belief. So an ecosystemic approach will not work unless we change that mindset. So we also have to go into some of those invisible aspects of an ecosystem.
A quick bit of promotion for Vishal and his work. If you're not familiar, dear audience, with the happiness curriculum, I definitely encourage you to discover it. It's amazing. So my kind of takeaway from what the four of you have just said is that more or less still an emergent kind of concept, at least kind of in a kind of mainstream perspective. Still, it's in infancy. You all believe in the potential. Some of you have already raised that, yes, potential, but how do we get there? So now, indeed, let's go into blue sky thinking mode. In your kind of ideal version of learning ecosystems, what would they look like? What would learning look like in 5, 10, 15 years from now, and back to the kind of the image of the caterpillar versus the butterfly, how does this link to, formal education, informal education? Is this merged? Is this still coexisting? Kind of what roles for technology and all of this? And what are the main barriers? I mean, is it mostly about policymaking? Is it about, caregivers, families believing in this? Is it about governance, leadership? So what would they look like in 5 to 10 years from now? But what would hinder a rapid move to the vision you'd be describing? Maybe start with you, Emma, this time.
So I mean, certainly I can only speak from one perspective, or will just give, my ideas from one perspective, which is more government and policy, and what, we would like to see and what we would dream of seeing in the next 5 to 10 years. And the feedback I get from our partners, who are both formal and informal, say that they would like to see the introduction of a lifelong learning policy in Ireland that supports learners and takes into account a full spectrum of need. So economic, social, cultural. In Ireland, we do see different examples of learning policies, but they often are economic policies. And the barriers with that is they do benefit some groups over others. They benefit some disciplines over others. And unfortunately, some institutes over others as well. And what we have seen is what would be considered elitist institutes over others or community education settings. So we would like to see policies that consider the full spectrum of need. And we did see a policy that was brought in a few years ago that was really successful. And that was to support learners with intellectual disabilities and helping them to access higher education. And the reason that was so successful is because it considered the learner, but it also had wraparound services that considered the family of those learners. And I do believe that if proper investment and government arrangements were put in place for all learners who were underrepresented equally, we would see greater participation in higher education. So for us, that would be our dream at Dublin Learning City to see. I understand that that's just coming from a government or policy perspective, and there are a lot of other lenses on this as well from different perspectives. Another one which I would see as really important, and what we get back from our feedback from our partners from different levels of learning, is they need to be supported to work together. Often institutes or learning settings, their collaborative working is sectioned to an access office, which may have 2-3 members of staff in an entire university. And if one of those staff members leaves, relationships are lost, and then you're back to square one. So definitely we would like to see institutes being helped to work together. And I don't necessarily think that needs a huge financial investment, but more a policies and practices overview, and to see lifelong learning embedded throughout an institute rather than sectioned to a specific office. So just coming from those two perspectives, that's what we would like to see. Thank you.
Yeah. I really like this focus on lifelong learning. You know, there's been lots of talk about lifelong learning for a while now. Indeed, for me, a big question around, you know, can learning ecosystems help us finally kind of deliver on lifelong learning? Let me turn to you, Greg, now. You know, looking at the Remake learning model and your work, you know, if you look at 5-10 years from now, let's say, you know, magic wand, the Remake learning model has, you know, kind of spread almost, let's say, across the US. What would learning look like? What would these ecosystems look like in 10-15 years from now?
Well, in so many ways, it'd be commensurate with the vision that Kelly articulated at the beginning of this hour. And if I go back 5 or 10 years, I think to the time when my kids were born. And I remember saying when my older daughter was born, I'm hopeful that by the time she is graduated from a brick and mortar school, that we will have also a different sense of credentialing, of preparation, of support for her. And so I'm always mindful of that very personal example and try and think about it in the context of every young person. Because I think we have 3 barriers. One, Vishal articulated so well, and it's about the public mindset that public officials hold, that educational leaders hold, that reporters and the media hold about how learning happens, and the stories that we tell ourselves about how learning happens, because that narrative will drive the mindset in a place, whether it's a small neighborhood or a broader metropolitan region or state or province. That mindset is critically important to how we approach learning, because then it influences budgeting and how we commit to, particularly to issues of justice, as Emma was just describing. And for us, as we think about Remake learning in this region, we think about our learners in poverty, our learners of color, our girls in the STEM fields, our learners with disabilities, and our rural learners. For us, those are our equity pillars. And so justice has to be a core part of this conversation. And then there's something to be said about patience and time. I mean, the reality is that we humans don't do really well with change. Change doesn't happen in grand, big systemic moments where we say, and now we shall all have learning ecosystems, but rather it happens in thousands and thousands of little bets. And that's what public and private supporters all around this world need to do. Continuously make little bets in our teachers, in our librarians, in our youth workers, in our artists, our designers and technologists, so that they might work together and work together differently. So Seb, if I look 5 or 10 years ahead, this work is continuing. But for example, I would love to see a director of relationship, a position in every single school building, maybe even every single site of learning. You know, a person whose job 24/7 is to do nothing more than to build the social capital, particularly for our most marginalized learners, so that they're connected. If they're lit up by coding, or they're lit up by maker-centered learning, or they're lit up by art and design, yes, they're getting that support at school, but they've got an adult in their lives, apart from their families or mentors and others, who are helping them steer and navigate a rich learning landscape in the place where they might live. So that's one example of one concrete thing I might like, apart from the, you know, the regulations and the budgeting and the things that I think need to happen at big municipal and governmental levels.
Okay, you know, there's this whole conversation around the jobs of the future. You've just invented one. Thanks. Kelly,
But you know,
what about
Seb,
you?
you know, 10 years ago, there weren't directors of instructional innovation in our school buildings, as one example. So it's not so outlandish.
No, for sure. Kelly, what about you? You know, you were given this image of the chrysalid and the caterpillar and the butterfly. What would be your butterfly 10 years from now?
So there's two things. I'll paint a picture of a vision, and what the moonshot is that there would be places where this was the education system as a parallel to the current one. So we're not trying to take away the existing system from people who want it, but at the same time, we want to begin to offer a radically different option for families and for kids. So what I would imagine is that there are communities around the country and hopefully around the world where this is what education would look like, is that every child has a home base. It's a place for years-long relationships where they have that person in their lives who's responsible for helping them set goals, create learning pathways, reflect on their learning, build community, develop a strong sense of themselves. But that's not necessarily, those home bases could be anywhere in the community. They could be at a youth center, they could be in someone's home, they could be in a house of worship's basement. But they, and then there are learning hubs around the community. So imagine a former school building being converted to a STEM learning hub. And so rather than classrooms in there, everything is something hands-on, something. And what home base you go to does not indicate what learning hub you go to. The library is a reading and writing learning hub, and I'm using US organizations, sorry, but the YMCA is a space of civic learning. And then all assets in the community are potential field sites, whether it's the wastewater treatment plant, a nonprofit, the bank, places where kids can have mentors, job shadowing, jobs, projects, service, right? It's not, right now we have a hub and spoke model, right? School is this place where still the formal learning happens and then we connect out. Imagine that broken open, and that all of these home bases are connected, the learning hubs are connected, and the field sites are, and kids are supported in navigating all of that, transportation, the funding models to allow funding to follow the child. So our dream is that actually exists in a handful of places, because we think if we can be there in 5 to 10 years, those structures and systems are what can enable all kinds of people in a community to plug in. And I just want to say that, Vishal, I really appreciated your language around ecosystem, and that this is emergent and this is a mindset shift. And what we have learned is whenever you try to do this generically or generally for all schools it doesn't work, because too many mindsets are really still of today. And that this is, I do think, how you get there is by mobilizing the people who already share this mindset of learning. They've already rethought what success in life is, what learning looks like, who kids are, and enable them to build it. We talk a lot about the iPhone, right? If you had gone out and asked people what they wanted, they would not have said they wanted the iPhone. We do think that if you can get learner-centric people to create an ecosystem, a learner-centered ecosystem of learning, that people will be drawn to it, and that it will have the capacity to make our current system obsolete over time.
if you build it, they will join, basically.
If yes, I mean, if what we think is yes, and because there's a lot of belief under there that really this is about human connection, and it's what we're all longing for in the background, and don't trust ourselves to believe that creating. And I loved, Vishal, that you talked about an education system that creates the people who can create the future of our dreams. And you know, our view is that we've just pushed that aside and down because we're not sure it's possible, and that as you create it, people will, it's like it's their wildest dream, really.
Actually, on that, I'll turn to you, Vishal, because I believe, you know, you kind of talk about leapfrogging in some cases in your projects, in the sense that, you know, in this tension between, you know, is it about transforming what exists, or is it really starting anew? You work in contexts where there is very little kind of institutionalized formal education. You're bringing this learning ecosystems approach kind of as this first initial layer of learning. So how do you react to what Greg and Emma and Kelly were saying, and what's your kind of vision 5 to 10 years from now?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, leapfrogging comes from a Brookings study that came out way back in 2015 or 16, Why Wait 100 Years, which basically said that if we continue with the same incremental inputs in education, then it's going to take approximately 6 generations or 100 years for children from under-resourced communities or under-resourced countries to catch up to the current levels of learning and education of kids from privileged communities and privileged countries. So what we need is to break this approach of incremental change and reimagine the core purpose of education, which is what will then help young people from marginalized backgrounds to jump forward rather than taking one step in front of the other, right? And that can only happen if we change the game, right? Right now, the game is played in a certain way, and the game works for the top 15 to 20% of the students who typically come from privilege. It does not work for 80% of the students and young people because the game is rigged to support only those in a competitive environment succeed, right? Now, the ecosystem approach is potentially a leapfrogging approach because it breaks open linear parallel system of education and makes it into this spider web where learning can happen in multiple ways at multiple places by multiple people. To give you an example of an innovation that we've been working on for the last 12 years, we have a youth center in a marginalized community in a neighborhood in Bangalore for young people from 14 to 23. Now, the genesis of this youth center was really just a space for young people to turn up in and do what they want to do. So we have young people who just come and hang there, right? Or young people who come in and sign up for programs or courses, young people who come in seeking mentors, young people who come in seeking jobs, or young people who come in just seeking career advice. Now, we do not judge what young people come for, and we do not dictate what young people should join into or do. We've created this amazing web of relationships, connections across the larger community, where if a young person says, I want to learn coding, we create opportunities for them to do that. If a young person says, I want to learn to dance, we create opportunities for them to do that. If a young person says, I want to be a citizen activist, we create an opportunity for them to do that. Now, over 10 years, what has happened is alumni from this program have come back and become facilitators, not just in the center, but in the larger community. Young people have created opportunities for them which we as adults could not envisage. So, for example, a bunch of young people came to us and said, there are a lot of people in my neighborhood who have mobile phones and they get damaged and there's no one to repair them. And they have to go into town, which is expensive, to get them repaired. So can we learn how to repair mobile phones? And they started home-based services, repairing mobile phones for people in the community and also earning an income through that. So they became entrepreneurs. So I think that's how I see this as a vision. And for me, the key elements of the vision is a lot of us adults actually don't know what an ecosystem would look like, a learning ecosystem would look like for the future. So we need to step back and allow young people to create their own vision of this. And they have this vision because they're embracing this new world of fast change much better than we are as adults. Second, our education systems, now, as Kelly said, coming from an industrial design, are designed as masculine approaches. And what an ecosystemic approach is to move towards a more feminine approach, which is more around taking people along, around connections, around nurturing, around ideas of thriving. So we need to embrace that. We need to move from a masculine approach to a more feminine approach. A key aspect of a thriving ecosystem is letting go of power. And a masculine approach actually holds on to power and authority. And that's the reality of an education system today, right? So this breaking apart, this opening up that Greg and Kelly have been talking about is a feminine approach, and we need to embrace that. And the last piece around that, a thriving ecosystem for me is not just about creating learning ecosystems for young people, but also creating learning ecosystem for the adults in the system. Because we as adults come with our own prejudices and biases, and we hold back young people. So a teacher, for example, who comes from a privileged background in a school that we were working in, was always punishing a girl who came late to class and sending her out of class and depriving her of a lesson. After many months of doing this, the teacher sat down with the student and said, I want to understand, why do you come late to class? And she said, I get up early in the morning, I'm helping my parents with household work, I'm getting food ready for my other siblings, and I'm rushing to school to be on time, but we don't have a clock at home. Now, here is a classic example of how we as who come from privilege don't understand context. So if you want to build a learning ecosystem, I have to learn context, and I have to let go of my prejudices and biases, and I have to let go of a certain context. Because I, as an educator, would think everyone has a clock, right? And this kid is not interested in learning. She's irresponsible. But what's true is that she's actually being very responsible, very resilient. She doesn't have a clock. So I think that's the shift we need.
Well, thanks, Vishal. Look, I'm mindful of time, and I promise that we'd have some, take some questions from the audience, and as Greg was saying, you may have each questions for each other as well. So I'll just throw to you some questions we've received. You can pick and choose which one you want. There was, I think, a very interesting question around, if we break from the idea that the state is responsible for schooling, how do we not lose on the idea of equity and justice? There was a question around the role of technology and how that is weaved in now when looking forward into your learning ecosystem thinking. A question around the private sector and what role they could play in learning ecosystems, if any. So I've picked these 3 questions coming from our audience, and if you have questions for each other as well. So any of the 4 of you want to pick up on one of the 3 questions I just mentioned. Breaking the idea of the state is responsible, but not losing on equity and justice, tech, and private sector. Yeah, Vishal?
I could probably take the first question. We cannot take the state out of the education system, at least not in context in the global south. Definitely not. Education is a basic right, is a human right for every child, and the state is responsible to deliver it. The state is not fulfilling its responsibilities today, so we definitely need to hold them accountable and also help them and support them to transform education. But if we take away the state's responsibility for education, equity, inclusion, and dignity is going to go out of the window. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Anyone want to comment on that? I mean, can we move away from a state-based education model while not losing on equity and justice?
Seb, well, I have an optimistic view of human nature.
Okay.
Those who wrote the Federalist Papers here in the United States said men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. So I think there's an important role for our public entities to play in protecting the justice, particularly for our most marginalized. So I don't think there's any sense of taking the public out of public learning. It's critically important for justice and dignity and everything that Vishal just described. And there's an important role for private to play in terms of a private system. We see all across this world increasingly public-private partnerships in supporting sites of learning, whether they're schools or museums or libraries or other sites of learning, We've talked here about the important role of real life, real world experiences for our young people that very often involves our employers and entrepreneurs in being involved. There is certainly a role for private dollars when to be invested to allow for appropriate, developmentally appropriate experimentation and support for the teachers and technologists and artists and others who want to to experiment in appropriate ways as we advance the system. And private dollars can provide that discretionary support to test things that then might be supported publicly. But the public can't leave the sense of public education or public learning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kelly, let me maybe turn to you. What's your take on this and this kind of, moving from the caterpillar to the butterfly image?
So I think there's two questions. One is how you get there, which might be some private efforts to help instigate this. But what has to be at the other end is a public education system. And I think the hard part that we have in imagining that is, to date, what it means really to have the state involved is that it's top down, it's very directive, it's usually standardized, if not 100% standardized. So all of that would have to change. The role and the way of operating, if you were to create the conditions for an ecosystem to emerge, right, where individuals had agency in how they developed an ecosystem in any community is going to look really different, right, for a whole lot of reasons, not to mention just the assets, in all the people in the community. So it really takes reimagining the role. Like, what does governance look like? How does funding flow? So it is, I know I have found this, but I am in 100% agreement. This has to be something for every single child, with the bedrock of being inclusion and dignity for every child. So, but how you get there, I don't know if our public institutions have they don't have the freedom to actually invent the future. There are people in the public system who certainly have the vision, who have even the skill sets, but they don't have the freedom to do it when they're getting the public money the way they're getting. Then you have the outside of school time that has the freedom and not the funding to do it. And so our focus right now is, how do you find the nexus of freedom and funding to actually invent the future of education, with the idea that public money will flow to that invented system? And how do you, it's not easy to do this. How do you not make it a one-off that stands separate forever? And how do you not try to do it from inside, where it just becomes the caterpillar with the wings that can't fly, right? Rather than actually becoming the butterfly.
Okay. I'm mindful of time, but good news, the tech team just told me we have 5 more minutes. So I'll come to you, Emma, what's your kind of take on this question of public-private, public-supported, public-run education? And also, just to say, talking about technology, actually, that question was aimed to you, and how much technology is part of your work and your approach to learning ecosystems and learning cities in Dublin.
Okay. I'm not sure which question to approach first, but I would say that I agree with everything that's been said. And I think the common theme out of everyone's answers is that interactions between public, private, they're incredibly complex, and they are always going to remain complex. But I'd like to come back to the idea that Kelly mentioned earlier about a home base or a learning hub. And that there's no reason why that can't exist in parallel or, in conjunction to a private or public sector education system. And I know that's the route a lot of learning cities are going down, and something we would like to develop in Dublin ourselves. But then comes back to the question, what does that look like? For ourselves, we see it as, a hub or a base of information for students, where anyone can walk through those doors and will receive the information that they need, so that they would be guided to navigate their own path through education, no matter what that looks like. Now, therein lies a whole lot of questions around, you know, the resourcing for that, and, you know, the staffing for that would be, you know, hugely complex, and how much buy-in or how much interactions does that hub have with public and private sectors? There's a lot of questions around that. I guess this kind of ties in with the question about technology, but certainly what we've found in the last 2 years since all the learning has moved online is technology has worked massively in our favor. It's really worked in the favor of learners as well, and we've been able to engage with a lot more learners than we have previously. So it's something that we are certainly embracing. However, within the last 2 years as well, we have also seen students who, you know, generally are underrepresented in society, who don't have access to technology. And that's something that we're really looking at and seeing how we can overcome. We recognize as well that technology is something that is intimidating to a lot of people. And if you have a center on the ground in the middle of a community, people are much more likely to walk in, particularly if they are people who are intimidated by learning or may not have a good experience of learning. They'll walk into a community center. Like Vishal mentioned, they'll walk into a youth center, but will they log on to a Zoom session speaking about, you know, different learning settings? Maybe not. So that's certainly something that we're looking at, how to interact with technology and how to make it equitable for all learners. We don't have the answer, but that is something that we are putting a lot of our focus on. So ideas are always welcome.
Thanks, Tamara. On this, unfortunately, I'm going to be closing our conversation so that we can free our audience and the Learning Planet teams who have all the other sessions to manage. I'll just say, you know, I said in the beginning, you know, people telling me, you know, learning ecosystems, it's only going to be a fad or it's plateaued. And, you know, I was actually sincere coming into this conversation. I was kind of down past the last 2 weeks around the conversation. I must say that the four of you have reinvigorated me, have, you know, re-energized me that, no, it's only emergent, it's only its infancy, but you know, the potential we all see in it is there. And yes, there are barriers, but there's good stuff on the other side of the hill, if I put it that way. So look, I mean, I'd like to thank the four of you, really, you know, from the bottom of my heart. It's been a great conversation. I think an open macro conversation, not too technical. I like that about this conversation around learning ecosystems. It's all about a lot of value, but it's also about values and visions and morals. Thank the Learning Planet team, and thank you, the audience, for being with us. And I guess conversation to be continued. And on this note, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
What a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Be well.